Okay, before all the comments say it, no, that number's not realistically usable for a build. That's not the point. The point is, that's how high your effective HP can theoretically get, and it's honestly way higher than I expected going into this video. Even if you want to do something realistically usable and sustainable, we still have this number, which is still incredibly high compared to your average player. And the reason this comes as a shock to you is because a large portion of the community has no idea how defense calculation actually works, which is what we're going to be going over today. In the process, I'll teach you not only how to replicate this thumbnail, but also how to do that more realistic build, which is so bulky that bosses simply won't be able to kill you even without a shield, at least for a good while. Before we get into that though, let's actually explain the damage calculation from start to finish. Some of this might seem self-explanatory, but whatever you do, don't skip ahead. Missing even one step by accident will throw off your final estimates by a lot, and since this calculation works both ways, people trying to do more damage themselves also need to hear this. The first step in damage calculation is just your raw damage. Only a handful of things get calculated here. Your weapon's AR or spell scaling, any flat buffs, and the motion value of your attack. What are these things? Well, AR and spell scaling are pretty self-explanatory, it's just these numbers without any buffs. Flat buffs are things that show up in your weapon's actual damage screen, not just the final AR you see here. This includes every spell that's a weapon buff, things like Flaming Strike, Seppuku, even Warcry a little bit because it actually affects your scaling, which increases your base AR. Once you have your base AR and your added flat buff, that gets multiplied by the motion value, which is the strength of whatever attack you're using. Your regular R1 usually has 100% motion value or close to it. Charged heavies can pull upwards of 200%, and crits can push 500% or higher on some weapons. All this together makes up your raw damage, which happens before defense is even calculated. For bosses, I think they just skip most of what I just said and just have some kind of specific damage number, but I don't know for sure. Now that defense is involved, note that there's only one way to actually increase this stat on your character, which is by leveling up. It scales more on strength than every other stat, but all levels will at least increase it a little bit. Once you get your raw attack and raw defense, what happens? Well, I had to do some deep diving and I even asked TarnishedDev about this since they made their own damage calculator for the game. And it turns out Elden Ring uses the same defense calculation as Dark Souls always used, which is this complicated nonsense. Luckily, I speak complicated nonsense. You can either use TarnishedDev's calculator or the one that I made for my buff stacking video to figure out just how much defense will reduce any given attack. Now on to negation. This is the part where a lot of people get confused. This number represents the percentage of damage resistance you're getting. Most players know that, and that's as far as most people think about that. But let's talk about the various ways to increase it and how they stack. Negation buffs, like literally all other buffs in this game, stack multiplicatively, and they receive all the same benefits as everything else that stacks multiplicatively. However, since we're working with damage resistances here, we're actually multiplying by numbers less than 1 instead of greater than 1. For example, if you have 20% negation, that's calculated as 0.8 times the damage intake. Now stack another 20% negation buff, you have 0.8 times 0.8, which is 0.64, making you have 36% negation. Now, if you look real close here, like really zoom in here, 16 is less than 20. Contrary to popular belief, this does not mean the second buff got weaker. It's still multiplicative. The math is still the same. In all the ways that matter, that 16 is actually stronger than the previous 20. The number just looks smaller because we're working with a reduction. Every individual point of negation matters more for your effective health than the previous one, as shown in this graph, given effective health going up and negation going right. If they simply gave you 40 after both buffs, that would be an additive system, which for reductions means these 5 items would make you completely immune to all fire damage. It would be that easy to go over 100 in basically any stat you want. You'd probably even be able to hit 100 in all of them all at once. If you've ever played Remnant 2, you might have noticed that DR stacks exactly like this, which is why they have to forcibly cap your DR at 80%, so you can't go past 5 times your effective health. Otherwise it would just be one more ring before you're immune to everything. Let's pretend this 90 negation from Opaline Bubble Tier is permanent, and you use a buff that would normally give 50%. That 90 turns into 95, which looks like a tiny difference, but what this actually means is that your damage intake is going from 10% to 5%. It's being halved, just the same as if you went from 0 to 50. Having 90 negation means you can take 10 times the damage before dying, but having 95 means you can take 20 times the damage before dying, doubling your effective health even when considering the initial 10 times multiplier, almost like it's multiplicative or something. And you might have already noticed that 50% negation doesn't mean the same as 50% attack in terms of how much it boosts you. Once you start thinking about negation in terms of effective health, all the numbers are actually stronger than they look. 10 negation actually gives you an 11.1% boost to effective health, 20 gives 25%, 30 gives 43%, etc. So not only is negation still stacking the same way every other boost stacks, but the numbers are actually stronger than they look. But Seagull, wouldn't that mean tanking is OP? Well, yeah, that's exactly what it means. Tanking is OP. Let Me Tank Him has the right idea here. Go with a purely defensive playstyle and there's a whole lot of bosses you can just deal with. I mean, shields alone are already pretty strong, but when you mix in high negation and health, it becomes almost impossible to actually die. If you can't die and the boss doesn't heal itself like Malenia, how do you think the fight's gonna end? I thought so. Now, the last part of damage calculation is all the percentage buffs, which, if you want to know the details about that, you should check out my buff stacking guide. Otherwise, just know that most buffs happen at the very end of damage calculation. And as for debuffs, unlike with increases in damage negation, a debuff is going to give you exactly the damage increase it suggests, since we're multiplying with numbers above 1 again. Frostbite debuffs your negation by 20%, multiplying your damage intake by 1.2 times, which functions exactly the same as a 20% damage boost for the opponent. I hope that makes sense. I don't know a better way to explain it. Right, so how do we exploit all this in a build that we can use? Well, if you're using a shield, it's very easy to make something sustainable. But in order to really show off what tanking can do, I made a shieldless build that can survive an all-out brawl with Malenia over an extended period of time, with no less than 9,301 effective HP. Quick disclaimer, do not use this build against Malenia. Given the fact that she heals when she attacks you, and this build is not really meant to dodge much, a fight like this will basically last forever and you will eventually lose, which is exactly why it's such a good benchmark for the sustainability of the setup. Start with either full Bullgoat set or full Verdigris. Contrary to the wiki, which doesn't seem to understand how armor works for the new DLC armors, these armors are almost exactly the same. The general physical negation is identical, while Bullgoat weighs a little bit more and has slight differences. From here you want this stat spread at level 200. The Dex and Faith are pretty set in stone, Strength and Vigor are mostly there for tanking purposes, Endurance is just high enough to heavy roll with all our equipment, and Mind is as high as it can go after everything else is where it needs to be. I have 33 Endurance and 37 Mind here, but if you plan on using Bullgoat armor, you'll need 34 and 36 respectively. From here we want heavy Great Stars with Prayerful Strike, a Dagger with Endure, Tree Seal, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Verdigris Discus, Godskin Swaddling Cloth, Two-Headed Turtle Talisman, Well-Pickled Turtleneck, Boiled Crab, and our Physic with Opaline Heartseer and Green Burst Tear. For spells, we want Golden Vow, Bloodflame Blade, and Tree Heal. The overall idea for this build is that we maximize our effective health while also relying on passive healing through skills and attacks to keep us alive, while also having a few things in case of emergency. Set your flask to about even between health and FP. Activate Morgoth's Rune and do the following at the Fog Wall. Drink Physic, Golden Vow, Turtleneck, Crab, and Bloodflame Blade. Start out by fighting normally. If you notice your health is dipping below 2/3, use Prayerful Strike to heal you up. Now it's worth noting here that the reason that we opt for Boiled Crabs instead of Black Flame Protection is that Black Flame reduces our healing, even if the source is from Prayerful Strike. It's not supposed to, it's supposed to just affect flasks, but that's what it does. If you get really low health, go ahead and pop one of your HP flasks, but ideally that shouldn't happen too often. Now if your weapon buff runs out, that's an indication that all your buffs are gone, because most of these last 60 seconds, and Bloodflame Blade was the last one we casted. This is your cue to swap to the Dagger and use Endure as kind of like a free turn to do whatever you want. Endure Golden Vow, Endure Boiled Crab, Endure Bloodflame Blade, mix in an Endure and Tree Heal in there if you need to. Once you got at least those 3 buffs up, you're back in business. How many builds do you know that can just freely rebuff mid-fight? If you want to, you can also mix in Warming Stones or Grail's Roar, but you really don't need to. After a few tries, I was able to survive 6 straight minutes with Malenia. tanking multiple waterfowl dances and tons of grabs without really batting an eye, or doing a whole lot to avoid damage. And Malenia is one of the hardest hitting bosses in the base game. If you can't kill most bosses in 6 minutes, your issues probably go further than tanking. Also, don't add on any other buffs other than the ones I listed, unless that buff is Blessing of the Earth Tree, which is kind of optional. Most other buffs you're probably thinking about will override the ones I'm using. Please watch the buff stacking guide I made before deciding what buffs are worth adding onto your build, because a lot of people waste tons of buffs without knowing it, and ruin their own setups in the process. Okay, now we know how it can be used in a normal circumstance, but what about that crazy thumbnail? And how do you even figure out effective health anyway? Well, to calculate your effective health is actually pretty easy. You get your negation and treat it like a percentage, so you divide it by 100. Put in 1 minus that negation, and you have your damage intake. Get your actual max health, divide it by that damage intake, and you have your total effective health. Whatever is hitting you would have to do that amount of damage to someone with 0 negation in order to kill you. Now let's push this number as high as it can go. The problem is, this weather sucks. Okay, this weather's a lot better for what we're trying to do. There's 2 types of rain in this game. The normal regular kind of rain that happens in most places and gives you 10% fire negation. And then there's this super heavy rain you'll notice in Dragon Barrel all the time that gives you 20%. I need to find somewhere in the DLC with heavy rain so I can include Shadow Tree blessings, and luckily, the place I found also has water, which gives you another 10% fire negation just for standing in it. Usually you can roll around in the water and get the same regular rain effects on your character for 19 negation total, but that doesn't stack with heavy rain. So regardless if you're rolling or not, we'll have 28 negation in this circumstance, and we haven't even done anything yet. Now we mix in 20 Shadow Tree blessings, full fire prelate set, 99 Vigor, Morgott rune, fire drink, pearl drake, ritual shield talisman, verdigris discus with the overloaded boost, Crimson World tier, openly bubble tier, uplifting aromatic, flame protect me, holy ground, rallying standard, endure, and stamp uppercut. All that together makes my negation round up to 100 on all elemental resistances. Don't worry, it's not actually 100 negation. It's 99.9999368 negation. This means each individual HP is worth over 1.5 million raw damage, altogether making my full health equivalent to 4,156,512,590. So if you're ever wondering who would win between the strongest spear and the strongest shield, the shield wins thousands of times over. Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure to like and subscribe. Have a good one. Do all the algorithm crap.